Welcome everybody, and yeah, really thanks for giving me the opportunity here, Max. Feature flags and DevOps and kind of the development lifecycle is definitely a passion of mine. And today we're diving into why feature flags are important. We're not really talking about national flags, but really how toggle switches or toggle flippers or whatever you call them in your particular place of work, we're going to see how they can help us move faster into production. And some of the benefits that we get along the way with that. Just before we get started, a little bit about myself. As Max mentioned, my name's Travis, and I work as a principal engineer out of a company called SPS Commerce. And SPS Commerce is a B2B company and currently hosts one of the largest retail networks in the world. They're not necessarily a household name that you would know, but probably very much in the retail industry, a name that would be known. Some of the biggest retailers and suppliers around the world run through our network. We have over 4,200 retailers, including Costco, Walmart, Target, Academy Sports, Bass Pro, Cabela's, places like that. Our core products focus on fulfillment, which is the EDI, electronic data interchange of communication between the retailers and the vendors. And we also have products focusing on the assortment, which basically drives a catalog between those same vendors and suppliers that they can look through. And also several analytics products that report on various progress related to POS and other analytical areas. So it's a fantastic company. I encourage you to check it out if you have interest. And our company, like many others, has really been going down this journey of DevOps, which I think many are. That's probably why you're here today. And each of us are at a different spot in that journey, just like we were with Agile and how Agile has changed over the last decade. And part of what we're focusing on, like many others, is the continuous improvement of what we're doing and trying to get towards continuous feedback of what we're doing. And getting that feedback faster and faster is very important to us. Automation is key in terms of reducing friction. It's a key tenet as we think about DevOps, and just in general sharing, which is one of the reasons I'm excited to be here with you guys today, to be able to share some of the stuff we're learning and also learn from others how we can continue to evolve our practice. But one of the key problems that we've encountered, specifically related to our DevOps journey in the CI/CD space, has been around how we get more frictionless release in some of our applications. So what I'd like to do is describe a problem to you, and let's walk through this and see if you can relate to maybe a portion of this problem or to all of this problem, and get your thoughts on that. So first of all, if you're using Git or you're in GitHub, you probably have a master branch. Maybe you're using a different source control system, you have a trunk branch or some similar functionality. Basically, we're looking for a branch in the CI/CD landscape that is always buildable, always deployable. And that's what we look to achieve. You may be working towards other types of release cycles in your DevOps atmosphere. Those could be release trains, those could be multiple active release branches. But for the sake of the discussion of this problem, let's just focus on the master standard branch for CI/CD and the always buildable approach. When we go to develop a piece of code, we branch off master. We create a feature branch, and we go ahead and we build our code inside that. Typically, those branches, ideally in CI/CD and DevOps, are short-lived and fast, and we PR, pull request, or merge that code back into master as quick as we can, as quickly as makes sense. We don't always achieve that, and sometimes those branches live much longer than we want them to. But definitely, the idea is to get them short-lived and out of the way within a sprint. We get that code merged back into master, which is great. And master automatically kicks off our continuous integration system and builds our immutable version artifacts at version 1.2. That automatically kicks off our continuous deployment system, which deploys into the development environment, version 1.2. I'm testing it, I'm looking at it, I'm getting that feedback quick because all this has happened automatically. And so hopefully in your DevOps journey, you're here already, or you're moving towards this type of scenario, and you're ready to keep moving that along and get it out to production. You might have other environments in between, but for the sake of the illustration, that's where we're headed next. Is we have version 1.1 there, but we need to get our code updated to the next version. And before our continuous delivery can deploy to production, the ominous gate typically comes in at this point. And what is this gate that's appeared that's kind of blocked this deployment? It could be many different things in different organizations. That could be a product owner who suggested that feature they requested actually isn't supposed to be deployed till next Tuesday, and they need you to hold off on that because you don't necessarily want to release it yet. It could be a QA related issue. Perhaps you have a QA team. Perhaps you have QA responsibilities within your embedded service teams. Whatever it may be, maybe there is a QA issue that you found and you need to actually block that deployment and wait for a fix to come through. So as a result, your work continues to sit in the dev environment. So you go back and you start working on your next feature. That's feature 2. And it may be related, may not be related, maybe just the next thing on the backlog. But as that's happening, of course, a bug fix comes in, a critical bug fix that has to be made to production. And so you make that bug fix in your additional bug fix branch. We're going to merge that back into master, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to automatically build that. It'll become version 1.3, push that out to our dev environment automatically, and that'll be version 1.3 going into dev now. And now you're at a point where you've tested it, QA says it's good, product wants that in production right away. But unfortunately, we're blocked, and we're blocked of going into production because we know that that other green feature we developed can't go yet. And in this world of a single pipeline and getting code through it that's always buildable, this is very problematic. I have other ways around it for sure. I could have built off of a feature branch. I could have moved that code through on a side patch. I could have deployed a separate revision directly to production, skipping the dev environment. There's lots of things I could have done, but they don't offer simplicity, and they usually require some type of coordination involved in it. So while all this is happening, you have other teams that are depending on you too. Those other teams are looking for that green feature that you've developed, and it's just not available in production yet because you're held off on that. And so this starts to grow as an organizational level. Consider this as a single pipeline in a microservice or a tiny service among many, and the problem really compounds from there. So I'm hoping that this illustration of a problem is not lost on you, and that this is some of the situations you face, because in our particular organization, this has been a large problem in building simplicity into our pipelines.
This looks very familiar.
Yeah, this often leads to cherry picking, which is ugly and just problems, like full of issues.
I agree with you 100%. I have looked to solve this in many ways throughout the last decade and beyond of development. Some ways more elegant than others, unfortunately. So moving ahead, let's propose a solution then. Obviously a solution involving feature flags and how that changes this. We have our master branch, we're building our code, we're building out that feature, and we put our code in. But the next thing that we do is a little bit different. Instead of merging it back right away, we're actually going to go ahead and we're going to add a feature flag. And for the sake of this discussion, the feature flag is really just a Boolean, right? It's an if statement that is in your code. And it decides whether the feature is turned on or not. It could be maybe a little navigational link that takes you to a new page, and we're just going to have a feature that turns that on and off based on a configuration setting. And we're going to go ahead with that coded feature flag and our coded feature that's a part of it, and we'll follow the same process, and we'll merge it back into our master environment, which goes ahead and does our typical build to our version 1.2, deploys out to dev. And after the dev environment, this is where we got stuck before, we can immediately upgrade our production environment to the new version. Why can we do this now? And the reason is because we've introduced the feature decision provider. This is an abstraction that sits outside of our deployment pipeline that gives us the ability to turn features on and off. So when we went and deployed that to production, the feature was not turned on. That decision can be made and held back to this abstraction, and gives us the option to move that gate to a different part of the process. So now, if we want to turn that on for a particular user, I could code to do that. I could say, I only want this feature to come on when our product owner tests it out right now. And we can continue to move and get true continuous deployment all the way through. In our bug fix scenario, so we work on that bug fix, that critical bug fix that came through, we're now no longer blocked by the friction of that, and we can go straight to production with that release, knowing that we don't have to worry about that other piece of code that sits there. And our other services that were waiting for us, again, if we're using contextual related feature flags that could detect maybe a header, for example, in an HTTP request, could be authorization of that particular user and their role, Could be some type of account indicator that tells me those are internal services from our organization and I want them to have access to that feature and them only. The sky is really the limit on how and where we want to enable some of that flexibility for that feature. But the important part is that by introducing the feature decision provider here and spending the time to code in that feature flag, my deploy does not equal my release. They're now two totally separate concepts that can be controlled and levered independently, which is very important. So no good presentation is complete without a Martin Fowler quote. And of course, Martin Fowler has many opinions on feature flags too, which are fantastic. And he defines it as this: a powerful technique allowing teams to modify system behavior without changing their code. And so you might call them different things: config flags in a settings file. You might call them feature toggles, flippers, whatever the case. There are four kind of categories of feature flags that we should consider. The first being the release flag. And the release flag is one of the examples we just looked at, that new business feature that wants to get out, that is needs to be tested and then marketed and released at a certain time potentially. And that gives me a lot of flexibility to decide how and where I want to release that. The second type is operational. This is kind of like a release flag, but intended more on the technical side. As an example, I might use this to reduce the dependency on a new or I should say, sorry, reduce the risk on a new dependency that I'm adding. So think about that new HTTP dependency you added that you maybe want to turn off or you want to change or flip. This gives me the confidence to deploy and be able to kind of traffic shape a little bit if I need to. Or as an example, I could use kill switches for that, where I just need to kill a certain operational technique. There's also experimental flags, similar to release flag, but in this way, I may not intend or have a decisive direction on which way I want to go with a particular feature. And so I introduce an experimental flag that allows me to just experiment with a portion of my consumers, a portion of my customers or clients that are using it, to see how they use it compared to the others that don't, or had a difference in the feature some way. And the last one would be permission-based flags, which basically allows me to designate easily people for different types of testing. So I could designate some context for alpha testing or for other needs of specific customers. In some ways, this can sometimes take on or take over your permission system within your app, but there's a clear differentiation between the two. So with feature flags, I'm getting a lot of flexibility, and I just want to make sure that you understand some of those advantages before we move forward. We talked briefly about the different types of branching and how you may be using master and keeping it in an always deployable state. And I also spoke briefly about how I was worried that some of my feature branches actually last longer than I want them to. Why is that? Because the feature that I'm building might be longer or bigger than I expect. And so using feature flags, I now have the ability to commit that faster and incomplete back to the master branch, knowing that it can be released to production and it won't hurt anybody because it is disabled automatically. As a result of that, without as many feature branches out there, I'm now getting a better effect of true CI, right? Because if I'm using continuous integration, I'm doing that across my branches. I'm not really integrating with everybody else on my team in that given day, unless I'm merging it back to master. So we're getting better continuous integration. We're getting to things faster. We're getting that faster feedback loop by building and committing to that more often. I can ship faster as well. Not necessarily because the button is any faster for me to hit, but because from a confidence perspective, I know that I can release this piece of code without any large concerns. Rollback is easy for me because I'm not actually rolling back. I'm actually just disabling a feature. And I can actually deploy features into production and just test them out myself before I turn that feature on. Testing in production is now much more of a reality because you have these mechanisms to control it. A/B testing is possible, canary releases are possible. And in general, you may consider whether you need this many environments or not. Maybe you had a test and a stage and a pre-prod environment, each suited for different people to test at various levels of deployment. Maybe that's not necessary anymore because you can now control those via feature flag in a single production environment, even a dev environment. And the culture. Feature flags can change your culture a lot. Specifically speaking, I no longer talk about feature flags as a question of, should we do a feature flag for this? It's kind of just the general approach to development across a lot of the teams. And it can change how your teams work in terms of who actually enables that flag. Fairly controversial, I know, for some for some teams. They don't want their product owners turning on and off the features for various technical reasons. But if you have product owners that are truly embedded inside your service teams, there's no reason that can't be a nice culture and a nice practice for them to take ownership of as well. In general, the ultimate goal of software engineering team is to deliver high quality software, and it must solve a business problem, and it must do it as quickly as possible. In general, would be effective. And if you are here, you've likely read or seen portions of the State of DevOps report for 2019. And it proposes 4 interesting metrics that indicate you has elite performance. And if we take a look at each one of these, deploy frequency, lead time for changes, time to restore a service, and change failure rate, each one of these can be clearly and distinctly enabled by using feature flags in different ways. Obviously, deployment frequency, I feel more confident to deploy more often. I'm not blocked for any reason by getting where I need to go in the environment that I need to get it to. Lead time for changes, in this case, you're elite if you can do that in less than 1 day. And there's no reason why we can't get out features a lot faster now, knowing that we have the confidence to roll them back by the flip of a button, not by an actual deployment. And time to restore service, maybe I'm using those operational flags to shape some of the traffic or use kill switches. And change failure rate, the more often we practice, the more often we do something, the better you get at it. So the expectation is that you do fail a lot less in your deployment. So let's dive in and take a look at a feature flag in its simplest form and see what that looks like. So in this example, setting up a user, I have a simple setup user function, which calls another create user function. What it's actually doing isn't super important to us at this point, but what we do know is that in this piece of code, I want to add new functionality. I'm going to follow a feature flagging approach. So I'm going to create some new code here, which is the SendGrid email. And SendGrid, if you're not familiar with it, is a software as a service for sending emails. And so here I have my feature flag at the top, and it's basically going to just propose a Boolean there is SendGrid email enabled. And if it's true, then it's going to send that new user an email. Pretty straightforward and pretty simple. But what does that function for determining if SendGrid is enabled look like? In its simplest form, it could just return a Boolean to me. Now, we know that a key aspect of feature flags is that it must be external to the code base. I do not want to modify code in order to change the behavior. So that probably wouldn't achieve any benefit at all for us, other than maybe we could commit it to master and disable it while I work on something else. To move it outside the code base, we could move it to a configuration file and determine from there whether I use SendGrid. That would allow me to enable it and disable it in an environment, which works well. But if I truly want to take advantage of a bunch of the flexibility that we talked about, probably moving it to a totally abstracted feature decision provider where that's a separate HTTP service that I can ask for makes a lot of sense. And that requires me to do very little deployments or changes, especially if I'm working with immutable configuration inside of a container or something like that. Great, so we've introduced this flag, but this type of addition may happen sometimes, but in a lot of cases, feature flags are an augmentation of existing features. So what I mean by that is you're generally not just saying, oh, add this brand new feature, you're actually changing something up. There's other orchestration or workflow that's being adjusted. So in this case, if we look and consider this to be the old code where we were using just a local SMTP server maybe to send the email, then you can see how we'd have the difference here and how we're writing this if-else statement to create the difference of the feature flag. Pretty simple, I think. The difference is that we haven't really achieved all the flexibility because that SendGrid email check isn't user context based. It doesn't look at the user and say, oh, I'd like to enable a feature specifically for Travis or for Max. Instead, we need to modify it to gain that functionality. So we might modify that is SendGrid email enabled to pass in the user, and then we might modify our function below to now pass that user context along to the feature decision provider service that we have and have it make a decision totally abstracted from this application about whether to turn that feature on. And now you can see where the possibilities really explode of what we can do with this in terms of canary, A/B testing, just testing for myself in production, and how it gains us a sense of confidence. That being said, I think even through this simple illustration, there are some important realizations about feature flags that you just have to, I guess, come to terms with, so to speak. They took me a little bit to get across, or these were some of the humps that I had issues with getting into feature flags that kind of stopped me a bit. And so I thought it a good point to stop and talk about those, given the simple example that we have. First would be this idea of shifting left. Really, all we've done is we've taken the complexities of our releases that we used to deal with in branches and have branches set up to deal with these different versions and releases and everything like that. And we've shifted that left into the code base. And that may seem not like a big deal, but now I've actually complicated my code base quite a bit, right? I'm gonna have these scattered all over the place. The reason I'm okay with that is because I can deal with that through architectural principles a lot easier in code than I ever could using a construct like GitHub or source control to do that for me. That didn't really make sense to couple those together. So that's one aspect. The next, of course, is it affects my maintainability. With this added complexity, I'm just getting more difficult to reason about my system. My system can now be configured and different flags turn on that affect each other in so many different ways the more you do this. It can be complex. And that's just something that you're gonna have to learn to deal with and learn to live with as a part of it. And recognize that as a result of it, your development time is just longer. But the trade-off of the development time is so much better in the long term, having the flexibility and the options that we talked about, and gives you that sense of confidence and quality of code. Probably the most difficult thing that I struggled with at first was changes to the existing code, because I was always sold on feature flags that they would provide this confidence that when I deployed and I had the flag off, it couldn't affect me. There was no risk. But the fact of the matter is there is still risk, because I had to add that orchestrator code, that if-else statement, the wrapper part of it, I still had to add that in. And so there's always a risk that maybe I break that in production. But what's important to recognize is that that's typically a very binary type of statement, and you'll be able to trust your feature decision provider. So, that if-else statement wasn't complex for me to add in. Is there a risk it could break? Absolutely. And have I done it? Absolutely. I've broken production with poor code that I've written introducing a feature flag of what I thought would be off. But the more you practice it, the better you get at it, and it will become a non-issue for you as you put those patterns in place, as it become pretty standard across the different applications you use. Additionally, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't be unit testing, right? Again, those decisions are usually pretty binary and pretty easily testable through your unit test code. And you'll be testing both paths along with the orchestration code to alleviate some of that risk. And fourthly, you may attempt or want to proceed with this using your own feature decision provider, but ultimately I would suggest that you just move straight into using one of the great tools, one of the software as a service providers that are available to you to do this. It's not really good differentiating work for you to do in building your own, and to build it with all the capabilities that some of the other providers have out there. So with that being said, what are some of the providers? What are these feature decision providers that are available to me? As I said, they can be configuration. It can be as simple as a config file or a database key value pair. It can be moving into the cloud in AWS. It can be the SSM parameter store as an example of a service. If you're using other tooling like Zookeeper or Console or etcd, all these provide key value stores as well that you can take advantage of, that are centralized for all of your applications to use. But ultimately, if you're able to, and you're able to provision your own targeted and open source framework, these will provide you the actual context of a user, right? These are where I can actually store user-related information, keep track of it, so that way I can make feature decisions on it. And these are some great options for you in terms of Unleash or Flagger or Flipped. And of course, if you do have full service as an option to you for software as a service, they are really a dime a dozen right now in terms of the number of them that are out there. They all provide great functionality. Ourselves at SPS Commerce, we use LaunchDarkly. They're a great player in this particular niche, and they're really leading the way with some of the items. Let's talk about another example. We'll talk about a few actually, different areas of our code and different types of architectural patterns that we can use it in. Now, we've seen the simple example. Now let's look at what this example and what are some of the ramifications of using it in UI code is. So in this case, this is a UI routing example. This is a small React application. And I have a simple navigation component with an unordered list and a bunch of list items I'm gonna add using a feature flag router, which is just inherited from the general React router. And you don't really have to know much about React or the technology specifically, but the concept we're trying to show here is basically that there are two different links that I can direct people towards. Notice the first link, the existing feature, is actually coming off of a fallback. And so we know that if this feature is not enabled, this is where you should fall back, display this link instead, versus displaying the new one, which is the new feature on the bottom. And this particular use case is something we call toggle at the edge, because what we're doing is we're abstracting our new feature in the existing feature from having to know about anything to do with the feature flag related code and keeping the orchestration of it here, and then just redirecting the workflows to where they have to go. Again, that's to help us eliminate as much code change as we can in focusing on it. I'll bring up an example of what it actually looks like for you. So here in the top there is the home and the existing feature. You can see I'm clicking around and then I'm toggling the flag on the bottom there, and it changes the navigation automatically along the top to be the new feature or the old feature. Shown here is an example of Launch Darkly, the application for software as a service that you can use for it. And I can particularly target individual users or any plethora of different attributes that you can send to it. But notice that I don't actually refresh the page on the top. It actually is connected via WebSockets for real-time updates as it changes live in Launch Darkly, which is pretty great. And that's something you have to consider when you're considering a software as a service provider. Should I be using some of these other ones that don't provide integrated libraries or SDKs for me to use? You'll have to explore that, but definitely look at the feature set you need. As an example, for a SPA related or single page application that someone might be loading up as tooling and keeping enabled for days on end without refreshing the page, it's pretty important to me that I have the WebSocket communication for this. So definitely very specific scenarios on where you want to use your flag and how you want to use it. We can also use feature flags in APIs. In this example here, we're going to use it in the users API. And so our users are coming in and they're accessing this V1 users endpoint. It's going to return them a list of user related information. How can we use a feature flag here? We might put a feature flag out front that allows us to control early access to other portions or other endpoints of our API. As an example, that would be the V2 profiles endpoint. It gives us a bunch of profile information about the users. Or I might also use it to control access to the next version of the V2 users endpoint compared to the V1 users. In a lot of cases, your APIs, you might be defaulting the version on as opposed to being in the URL, in which case you'd be able to control the default version that gets served out to individuals. Maybe you want to test out a small canary release to a certain subset of users using that new version. Or another way to use flags would be to introduce a flag to simulate a test scenario in prod that was otherwise difficult to simulate. Sometimes it's just difficult with the data that you have, but you need to test it in production. So we can add a feature flag that would only ever be turned on for a developer that would provide and simulate that based on a couple code changes in line at the API for us. And while we don't necessarily think it's appropriate to use feature flags to deal with versioning of APIs generally, because if I have breaking changes, I have breaking changes. There are some situations that I've seen other people use them where they, for example, made a mistake on the original API, and perhaps it was meant to return a 204, but it returns a 200, difference between a no content and content in the body. And maybe you're going to throw that behind a feature flag and just fix it in the version 1. And if there's any concerns about that, you can obviously flip that flag back pretty quickly or just turn it on for a subset of users. So it gives you some flexibility and some options there when you have to tweak. Of course, you'd want to be measuring along the way as you go some of the results of these. One of the favorite ways that I've seen other people explore feature flags, and also a way we've used it quite a bit at SPS Commerce, is the idea of migrations, or more specifically speaking, decomposing monoliths. In this case, this is an example of an application we had, gateway API out front that just served a bunch of information and did a bunch of stuff in a monolithic way with a monolithic database behind it. And we needed to start decomposing that. And one of the key components that needed to be broken out was a scheduling API. It was a simple background process that was built in Quartz that would schedule out and execute jobs at a certain time. And so we built that API out totally in parallel. and created a new database and new schema structure on the back end. And we were able to then feature flag that and redirect its usage inside the gateway API to the new and to the old, depending on who you were, and begin to test it out. In this type of situation, you of course have to deal with data, which is always problematic, and there's lots of different ways to handle the data. Maybe that's a one-time synchronization before we flip over the flag entirely to the new API, or maybe you're going to do it in a different way where you're going to start, for example, writing just to both of them at the same time and start storing your data while you're not actually using it yet, try and keep the data in sync. Either way, you might consider introducing multiple feature flags in this case, one that's a read option, one that's a write option, to be able to do those types of things. As an example, with our service, one that comes to mind, we knew that was going to have quite a bit of load on it, and it needed a bit of performance testing. And we did a lot of performance testing, but it's never as good as the production load testing live. So it was great to be able to turn it on for a set period of time for an hour and be able to measure the read access load on some of those services, and then flip it back and make some adjustments. And of course, you have the option to do that incrementally and start to shift over a certain amount of traffic, or based on a context, or based on maybe a particular account or client is more susceptible to risk taking than others, and you have a good relationship with them. So the opportunity is endless with the way that you can complete some of these migrations, and gives you a lot of confidence to keep building it incrementally as you move forward. In our case, we failed that deploy quite a number of times before getting it right, with just ongoing production issues after production issues related to just fine-tuning some of the traffic that was going to it and some of the payloads. And we quickly iterated on it and turned it off and fixed it and got it back into production and turned it back on each time to try and move as quick as we can to get that feedback. There are plenty of other scenarios we could talk about in more in depth. Here's just a bunch of different illustrations that you might consider. The first one being log level verbosity. A lot of people like to use feature flags from an operational standpoint to enable a more verbose logging when it's needed. Or some people even look at using operational feature flags to enable automatically based on a certain number of errors. So I got a threshold of errors broke, I'll automatically go ahead and enable a debug or a trace level of information. That allows me to go ahead and diagnose automatically once I sit down on my computer after getting that pager request. Dynamic configuration. In this case, feature flags aren't just Booleans. They can be JSON blobs, they can be a custom configuration. They can also be what we call multivariant configurations that offer us ability to do like enumeration type of flags. There's lots of different ways, depending on the provider that you choose, that you can store and read that information and materialize it. We talked a little bit about kill switches, but they're a great opportunity to shape some of that traffic or to turn off that pesky Google Analytics that is getting caught up with performance issues and slowing down our whole site, for example, under heavy load in our holiday season. Or maybe you want to use feature flags to sunset features as well. We often think about them in context of bringing new features online, but the ability for me to feature flag an existing feature that was already present and turn it off for all net new customers, at least allows me to put a rope around that feature and start developing an end of life for it. It even allows me, if I wanted to turn it off for everybody and see who complains, if I'm willing to take that risk. And then I can, obviously, if they can complain, I can turn it right back on for them very quickly. And of course, timed features. If you're putting out some different releases, and yeah, we talked about that next Tuesday illustration, perhaps it's holiday related, perhaps it's related to any number of reasons. Perhaps you're launching a new feature at a conference that you want to set out there. You don't want to be deploying that right at the same time as the conference is launching. You're probably going to have that in production several weeks beforehand and testing it with internal users. And just no one is the wiser that it's actually there available. And you timed it to come on with your conference. You might call these next part best practices. I think for the purpose of this talk, they're really just considerations in your organization that you might look at when you're creating feature flags and talking about standardization of that. Like everything in software architecture, it really depends. So let's talk through some of these generalizations as really starting points for your own consideration. So first is configuration. Naming is always hard. I'm sure we all have our own stories about things that we've named that have come back to bite us, or just awful names that we've used that really are maybe too ambiguous. And it's no different here. Here is even more important maybe, because if you name that feature flag something, it's going to live there a while potentially, depending on how permanent it is. And it can be hard sometimes if you come back and you didn't think about it too much. So in this case, I have a flag called logging verbosity. I mean, I would guess that if I turn that on, that I'm going to get more verbose logging, but I'm not actually sure. So it's probably fairly appropriate to consider, something like enable verbose logging. Now I know for sure that if that's on, that's going to be turning on more verbose logging than what I have now. But even better than that is thinking about your descriptions. And notice this description here is enables log level verbosity at the debug level. I know it's fairly simple to call out, but a lot of these providers don't require you to add a description. And so I would definitely consider pushing that in your organization, that you have some clear descriptions and guidance on how to do that, because obviously this has now provided me a lot more information about exactly what's going to happen when I turn this flag on.
Sorry, Travis. Hi.
Yes.
There's a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to answer them now, or do you want to answer them later? By the way, you can just, everybody who's attending, you can just unmute and ask the question, right? So instead of typing, it's up to you. But
sure.
There's a chat. I don't know if you want to cover that now or later. It's up to you. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. Let me figure out how to get my chat open here, and I can take a look at them. Start at the top here. Yeah, let's answer a couple now. This is probably a good spot. Thanks for calling that out. So I'll just read out some of them here. Do you have a sensitive class for certain features, products, functions that allow a different process or don't use flags? Are you using the same processes methods everywhere? If not, I'd love to hear where it's not useful, where it's not used in SPS. So I'll trying to decipher the question. This is from Steve. Can you provide any clarification for me? Steve, still on?
Yeah, there's Steve.
Cool. We'll come back, Steve, if you still have it. Have a question about that. Get some clarification. Steve asked another one here. I'd also love to know what role owns flags in SBS. Who decides scope, when they get consolidated and retired? I'm going to leave that one for a minute because we're actually going to touch on it as a part of this next configuration step. So we'll come back to that. Oh, Steve's stuck on mute. Okay, Steve, your question is just looking for whether you have specific areas where flags aren't used. We definitely do. We have a lot of...
1 second. You can try to unmute yourself, Steve. Now I clicked unmute also.
Any luck, Steve? Oh, okay. I'll go ahead and just try and answer the question the best I can, Steve. He said it's a little noisy there for him to answer or to go off mute, I guess. But I would suggest that it's not SPS Commerce at my organization as a whole that is using feature flags everywhere. Each team is at a different part of their DevOps journey. Some teams are much ahead and following a lot of these practices we're talking about. There are also many teams who are just getting introduced to a lot of these ideas and practices and trying to figure out, ideally with the guidance of those that went ahead of them. But there are still plenty of teams who are really just focused on trying to get automation working first and foremost in a deployment, let alone worrying about feature flags. And so we definitely have multiple and many systems that aren't feature flagged and that are working towards many DevOps principles like this one and others. So definitely every team is on a different leg of their own journey.
Steve had another question that I'm really interested in knowing too, is the role that owns the flags.
Yeah, and I've been touching on that a little bit. That's a controversial one because different teams have highly different opinions on who should own that. And so there's definitely a sense that teams themselves want to control when a feature is released into production, especially if it's an operational type of flag. And it also depends on in your organization if you're working in service teams or product-based teams and really where some of that lies. Ideally, I think that the team itself continues to control those flags and is responsible for the cleanup of those flags. And in this case, Steve, you mentioned when they're retired and consolidated. And to me, though, that service team is made up of a bunch of embedded team members. So that service team is made up of a product owner who may be, focusing on the release-related flags. I may have some more operationally or infrastructure-minded folks who are really focusing maybe on some of those operational flags. But in general, it really it depends on how you define a team.
Can I ask another question that just sort of comes from that? Because you mentioned the team responsible for cleanup, and I always feel like the cleaning up of the flags must have the potential to introduce issues.
Absolutely. Can we come back to that one? Because that one I actually have another slide on that we're going to get to in a minute.
That's good.
Perfect. I see Igor has a question here as well. Where would you usually place your flags? At API level, controller, or HTML? Really good question. Of course, I'll use the it depends response, because it really does, right? It depends on what you're building. You may have feature flags that only ever exist on the UI because they're turning off a UI related feature. It could simply be a feature flag that changes your CSS style sheets to a different design entirely that you're not ready to release yet and you're testing. Or it could be purely API based, like the migration scenario we looked at, where everything is hidden behind the API and in front of the API, and all the UI that is in front of it it could care less, right? It just knows I hit these endpoints. Where those endpoints get their information from, that's its own problem. And you may have both scenarios, which is often the case. So we'll be building a new feature. We try to build it out as a new page that's behind the feature flag, but the ramifications of that at the API level can be quite strong as well, where you are required to use the same flag there. So you have a couple options in that case. You could use the same flag for both spots on the UI and on the backend API, or you could control them separately with two different flags. And sometimes that's an advantage because you want to test them each individually from each other and not turn on that UI just yet. All right, we'll keep going and throw your messages in the chat there, and any other questions. And there's only a couple more slides here, and then we can dive into some of those other questions related to cleanup as well. We're just talking about configuration and naming and description. Another one that I've kind of thrown in here, which is problematic, is consistent default states, which can be frustrating. Because let me break down this one scenario for you. You could change your enable verbose logging. You could call that disable verbose logging, and you could say that serves true when it's disabled and false when enabled. And that's a really confusing way to do it, and probably even very confusing when I verbalize it right then. Essentially, I just want to know the flag is on when I turn it on and false when I turn it off. And you can rearrange that and be fancy about it, but I would suggest you just stick with consistent default states and consistent verbiage for how you want to apply it. Centralize the flag access. So this is starting to touch briefly on how we might do a cleanup or how some of the changes come down the road. But it's so essential that you decouple the decision from your action, mainly because you might use that decision in different spots. You don't want to have to code that in multiple places. Not only that, your decision might actually be based on more than just the feature flag. In this example here, you've based a decision on a different platform entirely that you're deploying out that might be low-level config based. And then additionally, that key that we had there, enable verbose logging, that key we don't want to duplicate across everything. And so it's important to centralize that. In languages like C# or Java, you might make that into an enumeration. And then it's really easy to use your IDE tools to find any place that those are used. And one of the last config-related things that I want to touch on, which definitely comes up, would be dependency injection. And let's look at a scenario here where, in this case, as our app starts up, we're providing a decision here based on whether our verbose logging is enabled to inject the verbose logging provider or the default logging provider. And this, at first, feels like a very elegant way to use your dependency injection. Finally, something that operationally makes sense for me to just swap out with a different provider, and kind of feels like I'm toggling at the edge similar to that earlier UI example on the UI router. But in actuality, this is getting us in a little bit of hot water because we haven't made the decision in real time, meaning that this container, as an example, if I was running the app in a container, or even if I'm just running the app on another server, is going to have to be restarted when I change that feature flag to change the injected dependency. And that's not going to get us a bunch of those advantages that we saw before where I can easily flip the flag on. Additionally, maybe even worse, I'm not considering user context because I haven't accepted an API request here as an example. I'm just looking at it as a whole, on or off. And so that doesn't give me the ability to do any of my testing that I wanted to do from an A/B perspective or from a canary release perspective. So definitely you're going to want to, for example, in this case, you'd inject one service, which would be your default logging provider. And inside the default logging provider, you would look to utilize the enable verbose locking to make decisions for each individual request that comes through. All right, we're moving ahead. We're talking about lifecycle now. So a couple of these questions that come up. The first is, how do I know when I need a feature flag? And what I've been trying to describe is that I like to reverse that question and really for our teams look at getting them to ask the question, how do I know when I do not need a feature flag instead? And really have the culture just set that, yeah, moving forward, you use a feature flag for everything, but be aware that there are some key indicators that you may want to look at that these might be times where you don't want to use a feature flag instead. First of all, does what you're building actually have any risk associated with it? Because if you're making a change that has no risk, then there's no reason really to feature flag it unless you're looking to, I don't know, change it when it's marketed or released. But if there's no risk, then you can be confident in the deployment moving forward. If it's a bug fix, depending, of course, very much on what that bug is, but at least consider the fact that the fix may, even if broken, it may be, better than reverting back to any prior state that was there. And so adding in the cost and the overhead of building the extra feature flag, and then having unit tests that test an original bug state is probably not worth your time. But it really depends on the bug fix and what types of things you have to alter to do that. If you're changing something that is non-deploy blocking, it could be many other parts of your DevOps code base. I'm thinking infrastructure that really doesn't make sense. It doesn't exist as a piece of code. You're not gonna feature flag it because it's not necessarily related or will not block you in any way from deployment. And consider if you're already inside another feature flag. So if you have a flag inside a flag inside a flag, you have some pretty deep flag inception. That complexity may not be something that you want to assume at that particular time. So definitely consider whether it makes sense. And definitely in some cases, it does make sense to do that. You need that level of control within some of those other features. But in a lot of cases, maybe you can just piggyback on the existing feature and release it at that point. But if you think that that's not the case, you definitely go ahead with the more granular feature flags instead. Another important question is, how long do you keep feature flags around for? This goes back to some of the questions there about expiration, etc. And I'll just straight up pull up this chart from Martin Fowler, who provides a great illustration of the longevity and how dynamic they are. So our release toggles are, the most used examples that we generally see of releasing that business feature. Your goal after it's released and after you have everybody kind of on the flag and it's not even being used anymore, is to get rid of that code right away. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But you also have your experiment toggles, which you might keep around a little bit longer as you're making a decision on which way to go. But then notice your ops toggles live quite a bit longer. And in fact, in this chart, they don't even have a period of time that's forcibly removed right at the top there. And that's indicative to say that sometimes people add operational toggles to be those kill switches, as an example, that we never want to remove. We always want to retain that particular concept in our system, the ability to do that. Another example might be the migration scenario that we looked at, where eventually that's going to take a while, but we're going to get rid of those flags. And then permission toggles is here as well. And those are definitely considered to be more long-term because you might be baking them directly into your system. This is maybe an area where I differ a little bit from some of the other discussions and Martin Fowler as an example. I don't think that we should have permanent feature flags related to our feature decision provider. I think it doesn't provide a clear enough distinction on what we're trying to move ahead with and just creates a big mess for us that never gets cleaned up. And so I would push that if you have something that needs to be a permission toggle that is permanent, that instead that is a feature of your application that should be built into the administration of the application or the platform itself, and not remain as this separated development tool, especially because at some point, or maybe up front, you're going to want to have those permissions available to your administrative team, your ops team, your implementation team to continue to use, and you want to be able to provide a level of support to that that's baked into your product, not some external tool. And finally, cleanup. So lots of questions about cleanup, which is good because it's hard. Number one thing I've observed with the teams is that cleaning up a feature flags is really hard. And savvy teams view their feature toggles as inventory, which comes at a high carrying cost, and we need to work to keep that as low as possible. So some people consider feature flags the worst kind of technical debt. The reason is because you actually have both code paths in there. And not only code paths, multiple unit tests, which in turn bog down your performance of your CI system, and really can be fairly costly with that maintainability aspect. So definitely, this is a key aspect that as you bring this into your organization, definitely consider how can I effectively clean these things up. And I'll propose to you a couple different options that you have for that now. One would be, well, first, if I'm going to clean them up, how can I easily find them? And that's where using the software as a service feature decision providers provide a lot of value. Specifically working with the LaunchDarkly one, it has links into GitHub, for example, so it can actually detect in your code base, if you've set it up correctly, where some of those feature flags are actually being called from in your code. You also should continue to use abstractions. We talked about centralizing the decision logic, so using those enums, getting into one spot so that I can, my IDE right-click on it and say find all references, and it'll just tell me that, oh, there's all the spots where it's used. Hopefully not too many spots because we're trying to keep that impact low. But then you also have to consider the impact of how feature flags are affecting a distributed system. Maybe I'm using the same flag across 10 different services to implement a single feature that's distributed across them. Some ways that we've done that are to build them into distributable packages, and those packages themselves are compiled and available. And so I can remove a feature flag from that package without removing it from the decision provider yet, and then kind of disseminate that down. And once I know that everybody's consumed it, and they'll get breaking changes because they won't be able to actually hit those enums anymore, that would basically give me the go-ahead that I can go ahead and remove that particular flag. Consider defining an exit criteria. It can be hard to determine when am I done with a feature flag, especially if it's something that's been around a while or longer than you'd hoped it would be. As you add it into your system, consider adding in a definition of when I know it's done. In fact, you might even go ahead and add in a story to your backlog right away in 3 sprints from now that says I should remove this based on this criteria. It becomes very ambiguous, especially as you get more distributed too. So not just distributed across your services, but also distributed across different teams. If teams are in fact reusing feature flags for working towards a single feature, how do I know when the other team is done with it versus when I'm done with it? There's a lot to discuss, and it does require conversation and some working agreements to do that. Consider actually having a hard expiration date on some of your features too. One way to do that would be to bake it into your code base through automation, through some type of architectural fitness function. That might just be a unit test, for example, that says, if I still see this enumeration present or the usage of this after X number of days, go ahead and break the build. Just stop it right there. And sometimes you have to take that hard of a stance in order to make sure these things get done. Make sure you're cleaning up the old tests that come with it, because again, there's lots of overhead with that. And also from an expiration perspective, consider limiting the usage. So what I haven't tried it myself, I've seen other teams do is basically, a team is only allowed to use 10 at a time. These are your feature flags, allotment is 10. And if you haven't, if you're going to go ahead and add that 11th, you're not allowed to. You need to go ahead and forcibly clean up one of your other ones. That might mean that I have to do work to get that feature across the finish line and remove the flag before I'm allowed to implement that next one. And that's really a hard and fast rule to get that done, but I would really like to try that out at some point. It seems very interesting. Organizationally, cleanup just gets harder and harder and harder. So it compounds, right? The more that you use it, and so definitely consider these things as you're moving forward. The cost gets much higher. depending on how you segregate and separate out some of your projects and how they're organized, it can start to cost you quite a bit at an organizational level. The last one, I've always been a fan of the idea of failover Friday, which is the idea that, hey, on Friday, we'll just automatically fail our systems over. Now, kind of not quite chaos style testing like you might see at Netflix, but nevertheless, just making sure that everything is correctly failing over to any redundancies that we have just as a standard in the practice. And so considering something similar to like a feature flag Friday might make sense. Just take 10 minutes on a Friday morning of a certain Friday in the month or every Friday and just analyze and get stories in the backlog for cleaning those up as a regular cadence. Maybe I'll pause there for a moment. I know we had questions about cleanup. Before we move away from it, are there any more questions or thoughts or ideas? Steve says he likes the idea of expiration. Okay, we'll keep going, but if you have more thoughts there, just post them in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it. I wanted to touch briefly on experimentation. This is one area that I had seen was interesting. And experimentation, we have that whole entire category of experimentation used for feature flags. And it might work like this, where you need to perform a change in a calculation in its simplest form. And you're going to check whether your feature is enabled. And if it is enabled, you use the new code. If it's not enabled, you use the old code. And you might apply that to a percentage or a canary release or any criteria that you have of your users, and then measure the effect of that and see like, oh yeah, they're actually starting to perform faster. They are actually getting a bunch of error messages for that 10%. And you return one of those results back to the user, whatever it may be. The other style of experimentation, though, from a scientific approach, would have you performing calculations, but instead of choosing based on the feature flag, do I run the old code or the new code? You're actually going to run both pieces of code. Might be in parallel threads, might not have to be, but we're going to execute both. And the reason we do that is because we want to ensure that all users are still maintaining the level of stability that they had before. And so we're just going to give them the old result all the time, because really our purpose here is to gather real world metrics and information based on that incoming input, and then examine how it differs. So we might be rebuilding a piece of code to be more performant in a much different way. And so we want to analyze and make sure that from a comparison perspective, that this actually has the same output as the old code and the new code. And this is an interesting way to do that, because we can take the old and the new inline in our code base and then publish that to our logging provider, for example. And so I illustrate this to give you an example of feature flags really do hit a lot of scenarios, but they're not always the best choice for scenarios like experimentation. There are other opportunities. In this case, GitHub actually created a framework called Scientist that they use for their different experimentation approaches. One of them being in 2016 when they introduced the automatic merge of pull requests. They used the feature to test out the expectation of the old and the new based on individuals' merges. And interesting article. I'm sure you can Google it and check it out in more detail. But it was great to see their scientific approach to it. That covers most of the content that I had planned. At the end of the day, I think that we've seen true velocity at SBS really coming from that separation of the deploy and the release, so that they can run entirely independently. And to me, that key differentiation is what changes everything. And what stops us from looking for more elegant deploy solutions like we saw at the start. And so moving towards gets us a bunch of this functionality, but it's not free. That if there's any takeaway you have is that this provides a lot of power, but it's not free. I do think it's worth it, and you'll have to practice it to get good at it, like anything in DevOps over and over again. So let's open it up to questions and thoughts and ideas.
Questions, yes. Anybody got questions? That was awesome, Travis, by the way. That was a great explanation.
Great.
Very, 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 very well done. I'm very impressed. Loved it.
Perfect.
Anybody got questions?
Sorry, I have a question. So out of the feature flag providers, you mentioned that you like to launch darkly. Is there a reason why you like it? And are there anything, are there any free providers that people can start with to explore that functionality? Or can you start with feature flags for free?
Yeah, I mean, I just pulled up the feature management providers list here. That targeted and open source kind of slot in the middle, those are open source providers today that you would have to download the source code and stand them up in your platform. So they're not entirely free, but they're free to use. You just have to operationalize them. And they're probably a nice in-between for somebody to get started. They provide you the user context, which to me is the most powerful aspect. If you're still exploring it and trying to figure out like, well, what would it look like if a feature flag, if I did this or that, centralizing it to a configuration, does work and can be done in a simple way if you just want to base it on some pretty standard user context like an email address or a user ID. So you can definitely get away with doing it for free with some of those services on the left. I'd have to check, I haven't looked, but I think you might be able to get into some of the free offerings on some of the software as a service providers on the right as well, depending on your usage and exactly the amount of volume you intend to send towards it. There's also a large difference in pricing between usage of feature flags in the back end, like at the API level, versus on the front end. You in a lot of cases pay for monthly active users on the front end, whereas on the back end it'll just be a flat fee for any volume of usage. So lots of different ways to get started. You have to explore what is kind of within your price range and your budget.
Thank you. I've seen companies write their own feature flags solutions, right? Like a configuration management systems.
Yep. I guess I've always been an advocate for if it's available, buy it, because I think in this case, building something that would provide the same types of feature set that I get in some of these full service providers would be probably fairly costly to build. And not only that, again, I've mentioned that in the past, that the idea of the differentiating work idea, right? Like, is that really a problem that my organization is meant to solve, or somebody else solve that? And I think it's well solved by some of these other providers. And not only that, this is going to be an interesting way to couple your services. So, in a bad way, if you're in a microservice world and you're about to connect every single service you have to this individual point of failure, you'll want to consider whether that's something you want to do, or that's something you want to ship out to one of these other services that are very much highly available in multi-region and everything like that.
But by the way, what kind of integration does Launch Darkly has, right? Can I turn on the feature in Slack or Teams or?
Yeah, they provide a lot of integration. Just as a note about that too, in building your own provider, you also have to worry about building your own SDKs to integrate with where you're going to use it too, right? So that can get costly, and another good reason to use one of these providers. But LaunchDarkly does offer integration into Slack, so if you want to find out whenever anybody changes a flag, you can get update notifications of that. I don't know how interactive it is in Slack. I know Slack does allow you to turn things on and off or flip things directly from it, but they definitely offer some integration there. Trying to think what else we have it integrated into at the moment. I'll take a peek here. I'll just open it up. Got standard like SSO integration, all those enterprise level things that you kind of expect. They integrate into a lot. So I talked about the GitHub integration that they have from a sort of version control perspective. You can do that with general Git as well. They also have integration into different logging providers, like if you're a Datadog user. At SPS, we're a Sumo Logic user. I'm not sure if they integrate into that or not, but definitely into Slack and Trello. And you can also customize with your own webhooks too. So if you want to integrate it with it yourself, build customizations, you can do that too. And I do see Teams integration this year if you're a Teams versus Slack user.
I'm good. I don't have any more questions. Anybody else have any more questions?
Everybody's quiet, but still here.
I don't know if that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's still here is a good thing.
We're down to 11. I think it popped up at 18 there at one point.
Yeah, 18 was our max.
Yeah.
You know what? Considering the circumstances, that's not bad.
Yeah.
Thank you, Travis. Again, it was very, very helpful.
Good. That's great.
Thank
And yeah, as always, I mean, feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions on Meetup or on Twitter. Or always happy to chat about architecture and feature flags and DevOps.
Awesome. Do you want to throw up your Twitter again? Did you throw it up at the beginning? I think you had it, didn't you?
I had it there before. Let me throw it up there again.
Yeah, just throw it back up for us for 2 minutes while you.
All right. Sure. Right here. You can. I do have a blog there, travisgosling.com. I don't suggest the content is fantastic, but you can just click that link to find all my other contact info as well. So, and thanks again for the chance to speak and join you guys today. Really appreciate it.
That was great. That was great. We really appreciate it.
Thank you again. Thank you. Have a good the rest of the week, and have a good weekend, long weekend too. Thanks, everybody. We'll post the next session shortly. If you have any ideas or have any suggestions, please let us know.
Sounds great. Take care, guys.
Have a good day.
Thank you.